The philosophical scripture, Leviathan, is brought to you by not a prophet.org, the place on the internet to find spiritual guidance powered by artificial intelligence. The abilities required in a good interpreter of the law, that is to say, in a good judge, are not the same with those of an advocate, namely, the study of the laws. For a judge, as he ought to take notice of the fact from none but the witnesses, so also he ought to take notice of the law from nothing but the statutes and constitutions of the sovereign, allege in the pleading, or declared to him by some that have authority from the sovereign power to declare them, and need not take care beforehand what he shall judge, for it shall be given him what he shall say concerning the fact by witnesses, and what he shall say in point of law, from those that shall in their pleadings show it, and by authority interpret it upon the place. The Lords of Parliament in England were judges, and most difficult causes have been heard and determined by them. Yet few of them were much versed in the study of the laws, and fewer had made profession of them, and though they consulted with lawyers that were appointed to be present there for that purpose, yet they alone had the authority of giving sentence. In like manner, in the ordinary trials of right, 12 men of the common people are the judges and give sentence, not only of the fact, but of the right, and pronounce simply for the complainant or for the defendant, that is to say, are judges not only of the fact, but also of the right, and in a question of crime, not only determine whether done or not done, but also whether it be murder, homicide, felony, assault, and the like, which are determinations of law. But because they are not supposed to know the law of themselves, there is one that hath authority to inform them of it in particular case they are to judge of. But yet if they judge not according to that he tells them, they are not subject thereby to any penalty, unless it be made appear they did it against their consciences, or had been corrupted by reward. The things that make a good judge or good interpreter of the laws are, first, a right understanding of that principal law of nature called equity, which, depending not on the reading of other men's writings, but on the goodness of a man's own natural reason and meditation, is presumed to be in those most that had most leisure, and had the most inclination to meditate thereon. Secondly, contempt of unnecessary riches and preferments. Thirdly, to be able in judgment to divest himself of all fear, anger, hatred, love, and compassion. Fourthly, and lastly, patience to hear, diligent attention in hearing, and memory to retain, digest, and apply what he hath heard. The difference and division of the laws has been made in divers manners, according to the different methods of those men that have written of them. For it is a thing that dependeth on nature, but on the scope of the writer, and is subservient to every man's proper method. In the institutions of Justinian, we find 7 sorts of civil laws. 1. The edicts, constitutions, and epistles of prince, that is, of the emperor, because the whole power of the people was in him. Like these are the proclamations of the kings of England. 2. The decrees of the whole people of Rome, comprehending the Senate, when they were put to the question by the Senate. These were laws, at first, by the virtue of the sovereign power residing in the people, and such of them as by the emperors were not abrogated remained laws by the authority imperial. For all laws that bind are understood to be laws by his authority that has power to repeal them. Somewhat like to these laws are the Acts of Parliament in England. 3. The decrees of the common people, excluding the Senate, when they were put to the question by the tribune of the people. For such of them as were not abrogated by the emperors, remained laws by the authority imperial. Like to these were the orders of the House of Commons in England. 4. Senatus consulta, the orders of the Senate, because when the people of Rome grew so numerous as it was inconvenient to assemble them, it was thought fit by the emperor that men should consult Senate instead of the people, and these have some resemblance with the Acts of Council. 5. The edicts of praetors, and in some cases of the aediles, such as are the chief justices in the courts of England. 6. Responsa prudentum, which were the sentences and opinions of those lawyers to whom the emperor gave authority to interpret the law, and to give answer to such as in matter of law demanded their advice, which answers the judges in giving judgment were obliged by the constitutions of the emperor to observe, and should be like the reports of cases judged, if other judges be by the law of England bound to observe them. For the judges of the common law of England are not properly judges, but juris consulti, of whom the judges, who are either the lords or 12 men of the country, are in point of law to ask advice. 7. Also, unwritten customs, which in their own nature are an imitation of law, by the tacit consent of the emperor, in case they be not contrary to the law of nature, are very laws. Another division of laws is into natural and positive. Natural are those which have been laws from all eternity, and are called not only natural, but also moral laws, consisting in the moral virtues, as justice, equity, and all habits of the mind that conduce to peace and charity, of which I have already spoken in the 14th and 15th chapters. Positive are those which have not been from eternity, but have been made laws by the will of those that have had the sovereign power over others, and are either written or made known to men by some other argument of the will of their legislator. Again, of positive laws some are human, some divine, and of human positive laws some are distributive, some penal. Distributive are those that determine the rights of the subjects, declaring to every man what it is by which he acquireth and holdeth a propriety in lands or goods, and a right or liberty of action. And these speak to all the subjects. Penal are those which declare what penalty shall be inflicted on those that violate the law, and speak to the ministers and officers ordained for execution. For though every one ought to be informed of the punishments ordained beforehand for their transgression, nevertheless the command is not addressed to the delinquent, who cannot be supposed will faithfully punish himself, but to public ministers appointed to see the penalty executed. And these penal laws are for the most part written together with the laws distributive, and are sometimes called judgments. For all laws are general judgments, or sentences of the legislator, as also every particular judgment is a law to him whose case is judged. Divine positive laws for natural laws, being eternal and universal, are all divine are those which, being the commandments of God, not from all eternity, nor universally addressed to all men, but only to a certain people or to certain persons, are declared for such by those whom God hath authorized to declare them. But this authority of man to declare what be these positive of God, how can it be known? God may command a man, by a supernatural way, to deliver laws to other men. But because it is of the essence of law that he who is to be obliged be assured of the authority of him that declareth it, which we cannot naturally take notice to be from God, how can a man without supernatural revelations be assured of the revelation received by the declarer? And how can he be bound to obey them? For the first question, how a man can be assured of the revelation of another without a revelation particularly to himself, it is evidently impossible. For though a man may be induced to believe such revelation from the miracles they see him do, or from seeing the extraordinary sanctity of his life, or from seeing the extraordinary wisdom, or extraordinary felicity of his actions, all which are marks of God's extraordinary favor, yet they are not assured evidences of special revelation. Miracles are marvelous works, but that which is marvelous to one may not be so to another. Sanctity may be feigned, and the visible felicities of this world are most often the work of God, by natural and ordinary causes. And therefore no man can infallibly know by natural reason that another has had a supernatural revelation of God's will, but only a belief, every one, as the signs thereof shall appear, greater or lesser, a firmer or a weaker belief. But for the second, how he can be bound to obey them, it is not so hard. For if the law declared be not against the law of nature, which is undoubtedly God's law, and he undertake to obey it, he is bound by his own act, bound, I say, to obey it, but not bound to believe it, for men's belief and interior cogitations are not subject to the commands, but only to the operation of God, ordinary or extraordinary. Faith of supernatural law is not a fulfilling, but only an assenting to the same, and not a duty that we exhibit to God, but a gift which God freely giveth to whom he pleaseth, as also unbelief is not a breach of any of his laws, but a rejection of them all, except the laws natural. But this that I say will be made yet clearer by the examples and testimonies concerning this point in Holy Scripture. The covenant God made with Abraham in a supernatural manner was thus: This is the covenant which thou shalt observe between me and thee and thy seed after thee. Abraham's seed had not this revelation, nor were yet in being, yet they are a party to the covenant, and bound to obey what Abraham should declare to them for God's law, which they could not be but in virtue of the obedience they owed to their parents, who, if they be subject to no other earthly power, as here in the case of Abraham, have sovereign power over their children and servants. Again, where God saith to Abraham, In thee shall all nations of the earth be blessed. For I know thou wilt command thy children and thy house after thee to keep the way of the Lord, and to observe righteousness and judgment. It is manifest the obedience of his family, who had no revelation, depended on their former obligation to obey their sovereign. At Mount Sinai, Moses only went up to God. The people were forbidden to approach on pain of death. Yet were they bound to obey all that Moses declared to them for God's law. Upon what ground, but on this submission of their own, Speak thou to us, and we will hear thee. But let not God speak to us, lest we die. By which two places it sufficiently appeareth that in a commonwealth a subject that has no certain and assured revelation, particularly to himself concerning the will of God, is to obey for such command of the commonwealth. For if men were at liberty to take for God's commandments their own dreams and fancies, or the dreams and fancies of private men, scarce two men would agree upon what is God's commandment, and yet in respect of them every man would despise the commandments of the commonwealth. I conclude, therefore, that in all things not contrary to the moral law, that is to say, to the law of nature, all subjects are bound to obey that for divine law which is declared to be so by the laws of the commonwealth, which also is evident to any man's reason. For whatsoever is not against the law of nature may be made law in the name of them that have the sovereign power. There is no reason men should be less obliged by it when it is propounded in the name of God. Besides, there is no place in the world where men are permitted to pretend other commandments of God than are declared for such by the commonwealth. Christian states punish those that revolt from Christian religion, and all other states, those that set up any religion by them, forbidden. For in whatsoever is not regulated by the commonwealth, it is equity which is the law of nature, and therefore an eternal law of God, that every man equally enjoy his liberty. Genesis 17:10. There is also another distinction of laws into fundamental and not fundamental. But I could never see in any author what a fundamental law signifieth. Nevertheless, one may very reasonably distinguish laws in that manner. For a fundamental law in every commonwealth is that which, being taken away, the commonwealth faileth and is utterly dissolved, as a building whose foundation is destroyed. And therefore a fundamental law is that by which subjects are bound to uphold whatsoever power is given to the sovereign, whether a monarch or a sovereign assembly, without which the commonwealth cannot stand, such as is the power of war and peace, of judicature, of election of officers, and of doing whatsoever he shall think necessary for the public good. Not fundamental is that, the abrogating whereof draweth not with it the dissolution of the commonwealth, such as are the laws concerning controversies between subject and subject. Thus much of the division of laws. I find the words lex civilis and jus civile, that is to say, and law and right civil, promiscuously used for the same thing, even in the most learned authors, which nevertheless ought not to be so. For right is liberty, namely that liberty which the civil law leaves us. But civil law is an obligation, and takes from us the liberty which the law of nature gave us. Nature gave a right to every man to secure himself by his own strength, and to invade a suspected neighbor by way of prevention. But the civil law takes away that liberty in all cases where the protection of the law may be safely stayed for, insomuch as lex and jus are as different as obligation and liberty. Likewise laws and charters are taken promiscuously for the same thing. Yet charters are donations of the sovereign, and not laws, but exemptions from law. The phrase of a law is jubeo in jungo, I command and enjoin. The phrase of a charter is dedi concessi, I have given, I have granted. But what is given or granted to a man is not forced upon him by a law. A law may be made to bind all the subjects of a commonwealth. A liberty or charter is only to one man or some one part of the people. For to say all the people of a commonwealth have liberty in any case whatsoever is to say that, in such case, there hath been no law made, or else, having been made, is now abrogated. Chapter Roman 27 of Crimes, Excuses, and Extenuations. A sin is not only a transgression of a law, but also any contempt of the legislator. For such contempt is a breach of all his laws at once, and therefore may consist, not only in the commission of a fact, or in the speaking of words by the laws forbidden, or in the omission of what the law commandeth, but also in the intention or purpose to transgress. For the purpose to break the law is some degree of contempt of him to whom it belonged to see it executed. To be delighted in the imagination only of being possessed of another man's goods, servants, or wife, without any intention to take them from him by force or fraud, is no breach of the law, that saith, Thou shalt not covet. Nor is the pleasure a man may have in imagining or dreaming of the death of him from whose life he expecteth nothing but damage and displeasure, a sin, but resolving to put some act in execution that tendeth thereto. For to be pleased in the fiction of that which would please a man, if it were real, is a passion so adherent to the nature both of man and every other living creature, as to make it a sin were to make sin of being a man. Consideration of this has made me think them too severe, both to themselves and others, that maintain that the first motions of the mind, though checked with the fear of God, be sins. But I confess it is safer to err on that hand than on the other. A crime is a sin consisting in the committing by deed or word of that which the law forbiddeth, or the omission of what it hath commanded. So that every crime is a sin, but not every sin a crime. To intend to steal or kill is a sin, though it never appear in word or fact. For God that seeth the thought of man can lay it to his charge, but till it appear by something done or said, by which the intention may be argued by a human judge, it hath not the name of crime, which distinction the Greeks observed in the word amartima and ekluma or asia, whereof the former, which is translated sin, signifieth any swerving from the law whatsoever, but the two latter, which are translated crime, signify that sin only whereof one man may accuse another, but of intentions, which never appear by any outward act, there is no place for human accusation. In like manner the Latins by peccatum, which is sin, signify all manner of deviation from the law, but by crimen, which word they derive from cerno, which signifies to perceive, they mean only such sins as may be made appear before a judge, and therefore are not mere intentions. From this relation of sin to the law, and of crime to the civil law, may be inferred, first, that where law ceaseth, sin ceaseth. But because the law of nature is eternal, violation of covenants, ingratitude, arrogance, and all facts contrary to any moral virtue can never cease to be sin. Secondly, that the civil law ceasing, crimes cease. For there being no other law remaining but that of nature, there is no place for accusation, every man being his own judge, and accused only by his own conscience, and cleared by the uprightness of his own intention. When therefore his intention is right, his fact is no sin; if otherwise, his fact is sin, but not crime. Thirdly, that when the sovereign power ceaseth, crime also ceaseth. For where there is no such power, there is no protection to be had from the law, and therefore every one may protect himself by his own power. For no man in the institution of sovereign power can be supposed to give away the right of preserving his own body, for the safety whereof all sovereignty was ordained. But this is to be understood only of those that have not themselves contributed to the taking away of the power that protected them, for that was a crime from the beginning. The source of every crime is some defect of the understanding, or some error in reasoning, or some sudden force of the passions. Defect in the understanding is ignorance, in reasoning, erroneous opinion. Again, ignorance is of three sorts: of the law, and of the sovereign, and of the penalty. Ignorance of the law of nature excuseth no man, because every man that hath attained to the use of reason is supposed to know he ought not to do to another what he would not have done to himself. Therefore, into what place soever a man shall come, if he do anything contrary to that law, it is a crime. If a man come from the Indies hither, and persuade men here to receive a new religion, or teach them anything that tendeth to disobedience of the laws of this country, though he be never so well persuaded of the truth of what he teacheth, he commits a crime, and may be justly punished for the same, not only because his doctrine is false, but also because he does that which he would not approve in another, namely, that coming from hence, he should endeavor to alter the religion there. But ignorance of the civil law shall excuse a man in a strange country till it be declared to him, because till then no civil law is binding. In the like manner, if the civil law of a man's own country be not so sufficiently declared as he may know it if he will, nor the action against the law of nature, the ignorance is a good excuse. In other cases ignorance of the civil law excuseth not. Ignorance of the sovereign power, the place of a man's ordinary residence, excuseth him not, because he ought to take notice of the power by which he hath been protected there. Ignorance of the penalty, where the law is declared, excuseth no man, for in breaking the law, which without a fear of penalty to follow were not a law, but vain words, he undergoeth the penalty, though he know not what it is, because whosoever voluntarily doth any action accepteth all the known consequences of it. But punishment is a known consequence of the violation of the laws in every commonwealth, which punishment, if it be determined already by the law, he is subject to that. If not, then is he subject to arbitrary punishment. For it is reason that he which does injury, without other limitation than that of his own will, should suffer punishment without other limitation than that of his will, whose law is thereby violated. But when a penalty is either annexed to the crime in the law itself, or hath been usually inflicted in the like cases, there the delinquent is excused from a greater penalty. For the punishment foreknown, if not great enough to deter men from the action, is an invitement to it, because when men compare the benefit of their injustice with the harm of their punishment, by necessity of nature they choose that which appeareth best for themselves, and therefore when they are punished more than the law had formerly determined, or more than others were punished for the same crime, it is the law that tempted and deceiveth them. No law made after a fact done can make it a crime, because if the fact be against the law of nature, the law was before the fact, and a positive law cannot be taken notice of before it be made, and therefore cannot be obligatory. But when the law that forbiddeth a fact is made before the fact be done, yet he that doth the fact is liable to the penalty ordained after, in case no lesser penalty were made known before, neither by writing nor by example, for the reason immediately before alleged. From defect in reasoning, that is to say, from error, men are prone to violate the laws 3 ways. First, by presumption of false principles, as when men, from having observed how in all places and in all ages unjust actions have been authorized by the force and victories of those who have committed them, and that, potent men breaking through the cobweb laws of their country, the weaker sort and those that have failed in their enterprises have been esteemed the only criminals, have thereupon taken for principles and grounds of their reasoning that justice is but a vain word, that whatsoever a man can get by his own industry and hazard is his own, that the practice of all nations cannot be unjust, that examples of former times are good arguments of doing the like again, and many more of that kind, which being granted, no act in itself can be a crime, but must be made so, not by the law, but by the success of them that commit it, and the same fact be virtuous or vicious fortune pleaseth, so that what Marius makes a crime, Sylla shall make meritorious, and Caesar, the same laws standing turn again into a crime, to the perpetual disturbance of the peace of the commonwealth. Secondly, by false teachers that either misinterpret the law of nature, making it thereby repugnant to the law civil, or by teaching for laws such doctrines of their own, or traditions of former times, as are inconsistent with the duty of a subject. Thirdly, by erroneous inferences from true principles, which happens commonly to men that are hasty and precipitate in concluding and resolving what to do, such as are they that have both a great opinion of their own understanding and believe that things of this nature require not time and study, but only common experience and a good natural wit, whereof no man thinks himself unprovided. Whereas the knowledge of right and wrong, which is no less difficult, there is no man will pretend to without great and long study. And of those defects in reasoning, there is none that can excuse, though some of them may extenuate, a crime in any man that pretendeth to the administration of his own private business, much less in them that undertake a public charge, because they pretend to the reason upon the want, whereof they would ground their excuse. Of the passions that most frequently are the causes of crime, one is vainglory, or a foolish overrating of their own worth, as if difference of worth were an effect of their wit, or riches, or blood, or some other natural quality, not depending on the will of those that have the sovereign authority, from whence proceedeth a presumption that the punishments ordained by the laws, and extended generally to all subjects, ought not to be inflicted on them with the same rigor they are inflicted on poor, obscure, and simple men, comprehended under the name of the vulgar. Therefore it happeneth commonly that such as value themselves by the greatness of their wealth adventure on crimes, upon hope of escaping punishment by corrupting public justice, or obtaining pardon by money or other rewards, and that such as have multitude of potent kindred, and popular men that have gained reputation amongst the multitude, take courage to violate the laws from a hope of oppressing the power to whom it belonged to put them in execution, and that such as have a great and false opinion of their own wisdom take upon them to reprehend the actions and call in question the authority of them that govern, and so to unsettle the laws with their public discourse, as that nothing shall be a crime but what their own designs require should be so. It happeneth also to the same men to be prone to all such crimes as consist in craft, and in deceiving of their neighbors, because they think their designs are too subtle to be perceived. These, I say, are effects of a false presumption of their own wisdom. For of them that are the first movers in the disturbance of commonwealth, which can never happen without a civil war, very few are left alive long enough to see their new designs established, so that the benefit of their crimes redoundeth to posterity, and such as would least have wished it, which argues they were not so wise as they thought they were. And those that deceive upon hope of not being observed do commonly deceive themselves, the darkness in which they believe they lie hidden being nothing else but their own blindness, and are no wiser than children that think all hid by hiding their own eyes. And generally all vainglorious men, unless they be withal timorous, are subject to anger, as being more prone than others to interpret for contempt the ordinary liberty of conversation. And there are few crimes that may not be produced by anger. As for the passions of hate, lust, ambition, and covetousness, what crimes they are apt to produce is so obvious to every man's experience and understanding as there needeth nothing to be said of them, saving that they are infirmities so annexed to the nature, both of man and all other living creatures, as that their effects cannot be hindered but by extraordinary use of reason, or a constant severity in punishing them. For in those things men hate, they find a continual and unavoidable molestation, whereby either a man's patience must be everlasting, or he must be eased by removing the power of that which molesteth him. The former is difficult, the latter is many times impossible without some violation of the law. Ambition and covetousness are passions also that are perpetually incumbent and pressing, whereas reason is not perpetually present to resist them, and therefore whensoever the hope of impunity appears, their effects proceed. And for lust, what it wants in the lasting, it hath in the vehemence, which sufficeth to weigh down the apprehension of all easy or uncertain punishments.